Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. Before proceeding to today's discussion, I wanted to mention that my host here, PRN.FM, is having a bit of a fundraising push. This is the first time they've asked me to give a little plug to them. I've been with PRN for 8 years, and I've always enjoyed it. It was really important to me when I decided to do a podcast that I wanted to be part of a collective. And even if I'm not necessarily listening to every show on PRN, they've been terrific. And I like the attempt to bring some of the spirit of live alternative radio, talk show heavy alternative radio, call-in shows and all, to the world of podcasting and online streaming. So I urge you to go check out prn.fm/donate subscribe and donate to Progressive Voices, including the folks who've helped make Expanding Mind available over the last 8 years or so. Moving on, I just spent the weekend at the Cultural and Political Perspectives on Psychedelic Science conference. This was held at CIIS here in San Francisco and sponsored in part by their East-West Psychology program and also by Chacruna, which is a website you should be aware of if you're interested in intelligent reflections on psychedelic science, psychedelic culture from academics and independent researchers. One of the heads of Chacruna, Bia Labache, has been on Expanding Mind a number of months ago, and she organized this conference, which was really quite wonderful. It was challenging, difficult. A lot of political issues were raised. Sometimes there was some heated exchanges. Yet it also gave me the sense of the resilience of the psychedelic community, if we can even speak of a psychedelic community anymore, but at least the community that was gathered there, to be able to take some heavy discussions about social justice, about capitalism, about, basically all the important issues that we're dealing with these days, which as psychedelic science becomes more mainstream, inevitably begin to show up within psychedelic science. So the strange little underground world that first raised me in this kind of discourse space has definitely graduated to other sorts of issues. And one of the main rabble-rousers at this event, and we'll get to him in just a second, is our guest today, David Nickles. And I first came across his name in a journal called The Nexian, and there was a article with the very appealing title of Criminals and Researchers, Perspectives on the Necessity of Underground Research, which really piqued my interest because there's another David Nickles, whose name is spelled slightly differently, who is a very well-established researcher that I did not think would write this sort of article. And so as I was reading, I was going, come on, this can't be the same guy. And then it turns out, of course, that it's not the same guy. David Nickles has been a part of the DMT Nexus, the underground research world around DMT for many years. But a number of years ago, he started to come out more with articles and started giving talks at festivals and psychedelic gatherings. And I was very impressed by these talks. They had a political fire to them that I see all too rarely in the psychedelic world. Even despite the fact that so many people who are interested in these things are interested in a lot of the complex issues we face and presumably are interested in pushing the boundaries of what we say and what we do in relationship to the world. Nonetheless, it was very refreshing to hear David speak and to bring up political issues in a kind of post-Occupy way that in many ways have been ignored or not spoken about very much within the current psychedelic environment. And this, of course, needs to change even more today because the issues in psychedelic science are going to ramp up so intensely as the mainstreaming process continues, as corporations start to sniff out bucks, potentially big bucks, and as more and more people turn towards psychedelic therapy as a possibility for them to heal their own sufferings, which raise very important issues of access, of money, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very important that we keep asking these questions, and it's particularly important that we keep asking these questions from the perspective of the underground, because the underground is an incredibly important part of psychedelic science, of psychedelic culture, and it continues to be so, even in the face of many of the mainstreaming institutions and individuals who want to pretend that psychedelic science was never underground, that you can't have underground science. What kind of science is that? You need institutions, you need a PhD, you need expensive journals that are hidden behind paywalls. But from the perspective of psychedelic science as an underground, we can recognize the problems with the mainstream way of organizing knowledge in our society. And these issues are brought up very strongly by David and the questions he asked at the recent conference. So with no further ado, David, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Thanks for having me. It's really wonderful to be here.
Yeah, that's good, man. Again, it was a real rock'em sock'em weekend. So I appreciate your contributions there. But before we jump into the meat of the matter, I'd like to work our way through a little bit through some background and context, because you've been involved in what we could call psychedelic citizen science or underground research for a long time, and you've actually been an underground character for a while. This whole appearance of you in the sort of world of conferences and social media and visible conflicts is a relatively new thing for you, I know. So I'd like to get some of that background and talk about how you first discovered or became involved with the DMT Nexus, and really what motivated you to plunge as deeply as you have into underground research and the citizen science, particularly around DMT.
Sure. So I guess for me, this actually touches back on your statement about how there's an aversion to getting into a lot of this darker political content in these spaces. Because for me, I mean, this literally traces back to my first psychedelic experience, which was with cubensis mushrooms at 18. I was at university. I had a friend who had come across some. I was excited to try them, but also at that point, I had been pretty staunchly anti-drug until I discovered cannabis and saw that clearly the narratives around that weren't true, but I wasn't sure, the stories I heard about psychedelics and potentials for going crazy and, all the myths, you'll get the sense that you turned yourself into a glass of orange juice and what happens if you pour yourself out. So I basically spent like 2 weeks after I found out we had shrooms around, researching everything I could. I mean, I was on Erowid, I was on Wikipedia, I was going through the library and pulling peer-reviewed papers. I think the Hopkins study had just happened, and it was literally at the forefront. And so, most of the research I was pulling was 50 years old, thereabouts. And so I wound up taking an eighth of mushrooms, finding myself in the woods. All of a sudden, I'm having this, incredibly deep presence sort of explain to me cycles of life and death and the intertwinings of all of that, which gave way into realizations about capitalism and industrial society and the way that all of these things seemed interconnected and intertwined in ways where I'd had all of these understandings as unique, individualized critiques that had never seemed so connected to each other. And then sort of over the period of time of that mushroom trip, before it gave away into maybe 15 or 20 minutes of pure timeless presence, it kind of hit me with the full weight of, look at all these terrible things that are happening on the planet. You're part of this. You don't have an option to unplug yourself from it. So if this matters to you, you have to figure out a way to do something about it.
And at this point, but you already had like political consciousness. You were already interested in critiques of capitalism. You already had a kind of. Did you already have a kind of activist attitude, or did this really spur not only an integrated way of thinking about how all these issues fit together, but also really actually inspire you to become more of an activist?
I would say I had activist leanings coming from, reading histories of the Holocaust and being Jewish and looking at, these situations. I remember being, 6, 7, 8 and trying to grapple with, well, how can you find yourself in a society that's doing terrible things and do absolutely nothing to stop it? But I certainly hadn't had any sort of real strong activist political consciousness around things like capitalism. I had critiques. I had like, well, this seems like it doesn't really work for everyone. This seems like not even does it not work for everyone, but it's sort of stacked against all these individuals in ways that seem to need to be challenged. But it wasn't, I think it seemed distant. It was a point in my life where systemic understandings, I think, really alienated me in a way where it was like, these things seem so big. How can I possibly engage with them? And I mean, even just sitting with the outcome of, or sitting with the experiences of that day, I mean, it's not like I came down from it and was like, okay, great, like time to go dismantle industrial civilization. like the impetus was there, but it was still super overwhelming. It was still, it seemed like way too big of a question to wrap my mind around. And really what came out of that experience, and I go into the full length of that experience on the talk I gave at Boom in 2014 called Turn On, Tune In, Rise Up. Jesus, sorry about that. Anyway, that's up on YouTube. I highly recommend it if other people have had glimpses of those political consciousness. For me, it took me a while to actually clarify that. It took me a while to sit with that. And so what started happening in the wake of that trip was I was in all of my university classes on Wikipedia, reading about drugs, reading about psychedelics, reading about acid and mushrooms. And I hadn't heard of DMT at that point, but I was on Erowid looking through not so much experience reports, but, doses, information, legality, trying to build up as comprehensive an understanding as possible. And of course, as you start reading through some of these histories, you come across political actors, you come across, the Weather Underground, you come across the Black Panthers and their intersections with Leary, and you come across all these really interesting stories that clearly, to my mind, merged radical politics and psychedelics. And having just come from this experience where I felt like I'd been given such a formative synthesis of radical politics just by consuming this little mushroom with whatever information I had inside of me, that thread, that commonality sort of always was just there in, super highlighted font for me.
Yeah, well, I want to step in on it, just reflect on that for a second, which is, I think one of the issues is that we have a malformed memory of the 60s. It is having just written about the 60s and 70s in the counterculture, I read a lot of histories and texts, and there's a very, very common gesture that people make, which is they divide the 60s into two movements. There is the movement, which is political activism associated with anti-war, becomes supporting of Black liberation and different ethnic and gender liberations, but it's activist, it's on the street, it's engaged, it's political, it's real world, it's practical, pragmatic, and intense and radical often. So there's some tensions in that between the more radicals and the more what we would now think of as progressives. But that is divided very strongly from the hippies, who are the psychedelic people, the love children, the lifestyle people, the mystics, the spiritual people, the people making music, the people making the aesthetics. And that division is helpful to a point, but where it really misses something important, and particularly screws us up now, to have the kind of conversations that we're talking about now, is that there was a third rail, if you will, that my friend and colleague Christian Greer calls psychedelic militancy. And some of the psychedelic militancy took an explicitly left form. Some of it was more anarcho-libertarian or whatever, anarchist. But at the core of it was the idea not just that psychedelics turned you on to the nature of these political problems that then you were called upon to respond to in an activist way, but that the mode of activism itself was psychedelic, whether it was the kind of prankster media pranks of the yippies, going to levitate the Pentagon in October of 1967. That's just absurd. But that absurdity was a way of practicing politics. So when I hear you talk about that and trying to make these connections, in my mind, I'm like, yeah, I think historians and people in the counterculture and psychedelic people have done a crappy job of articulating and sustaining and revitalizing psychedelic militancy.
Oh, and I'm inclined to agree. And, it was a long time digging through psychedelic histories before I really even stumbled across the Diggers, right? And if we want to contrast the actions of groups like the Diggers, who were not so interested in levitating the Pentagon, but, instead were engaged in, we could say, sort of the prototypes of programs that we still see now in the more crusty punk and anarchist scenes, such as Food Not Bombs, right, where they were engaged with projects that I would say were more in line with like the Black Panthers Life Raft programs, right? How do we get food to folks in the community who need it? How do we get material goods that are produced in such abundance in capitalist societies, but then denied from entire sections of the populace in order to make sure that they maintain their appropriate value? Sort of how do we subvert that? And so for me, I was super drawn into all of the societal differences, the cultural differences. I mean, at that point, I was at school for anthropology and political science. And so I realized that, hey, if I take an explicitly ethnobotanically focused track within the anthropology program I was doing, that I could find a couple of advisors who are willing to take that on. One of my anthropology advisors was had very close connections to David Graeber. And so the sort of explicitly anarchist politics and some of the research I was interested in pursuing from the political vein didn't turn her off. Similarly, I had a couple of hardcore ethnobotany nerds who had somehow found a spot. There's one professor in particular who had found a spot at this university and was willing to let me do my own independent study through her. At the time, I was working for a botanist doing databasing. And so sort of all of those things combined in a way where I had access to really helpful advisors. I had access to resources through the university. And I had the desire to sort of find that legitimacy, right? At that point, I was super interested in the work MAPS was doing. It was like, oh my God, how are these folks, starting to get attention to this stuff? How are they able to play these games in such a way where, psychedelic isn't a dirty word? Because I saw the way that if I talked about ethnobotany, nobody really questioned it. It was just like, oh, here's some quirky plant nerd who's, looking into phytochemical, what even is that? And all I'm saying is I'm looking at the chemicals that are in plants. I happen to be interested in the psychoactive ones, but using that appropriately academically focused language, it allowed me to sort of mask a lot of my real intentions and sort of find the people who knew enough that when they understood what I was saying, I could see whether they were on board or if I needed to make myself look more appropriate. And so I was able to sort of Trojan horse myself into this position. And as that was going on, I had discovered Terence McKenna by complete and utter fluke. I had downloaded this huge drug repository and had it on my iPod on shuffle. And I hear this funny little voice come over my car speakers one day talking about machine elves and stoned apes and DMT. And I figured I wouldn't find DMT until well into my 40s based on the way he was talking about it. Fast forward 18 months and, there I was in my kitchen pulling white translucent crystals out of the freezer. And really the way that I found the DMT Nexus was that my sort of honeymoon period with DMT was daily use, sometimes multiple times a day. Eventually that faded into maybe near daily use. I mean, and this was over a period of months where I was going for breakthrough. I was going I'd have a breakthrough experience. It would feel so, I don't know, organic, natural. Something inside me recognized components of these places as home, as places I knew, but I'd forgotten. And there was such a wealth of information that every time I came back, it was like it had fueled all of these additional ontological questions. And there were never any answers. And there was never, sometimes I'd get crazy theories about, oh, maybe this ties into that. But it was never any real actionable knowledge. It was fascinating just from how is it possible to experience these things. But, after a few months of that, I think it was probably about 3 months in, I was sitting on my computer and I wasn't expecting any sort of answer or response, but just sort of to get the material out of me. I was like typing into Google, how is it possible to encounter disincarnate beings on DMT? And I hit enter. And the first page that comes up is from the DMT Nexus. And this was like a couple months, I think, after they had switched from DMT World and had dropped a lot of the front-facing stuff and really just become a forum. And sure enough, I found that here was a community of folks that not only were they not dismissing questions and bizarre, outlandish theories, but they were taking a really critical, really engaged approach to having discussions around what might this be. And for me, that was fascinating. And I jumped right in and, you had to get promoted. And so the easiest way I thought to get promoted was just to start helping out with extraction advice, because the texts that were available at that time, they were hosted on Arrowhead. They were really outdated. They were kind of dangerous and had a whole bunch of unnecessary steps. Meanwhile, you could find better pictorials on maybe even shroomery. The Nexus had its own text, of course, but the understandings and awareness of where to go and what to do weren't really there. And the thing that I've tried to always stress is if you understand the extraction principles and why you're doing what you're doing, you don't really need a tech. I mean, a tech is helpful for maybe the amounts that you'll want for any particular material. But if you understand the processes, there's no need to go, I have to have this person's exact directions. And so that eventually seeing all of these people engaged on extraction and refining extractions and all these other things, it was immediately apparent what a community of engaged, scientifically oriented and critically thinking individuals could do. And I was literally watching it in front of my eyes as some of the early developments into extraction techniques. I won't go too into depth, but using like fumaric acid for creating salts of DMT. There were a couple methods that sort of bubbled up out of that community and a whole bunch of conversations. There were questions about increasing efficiency and hoping to improve upon the yields that folks were seeing. Because this was also in the environment of a lot of the Mimosa Hostilis vendors getting cracked down on. There was sort of a constant cat and mouse game. This was before the major bust that I think happened in 2011. So at that point, there was sort of a desire to figure out, can we make sure that everybody is maximizing their yields? Because we really have and had a DIY ethos where we didn't want to see people selling DMT. I mean, we know that to some extent that will always be a reality of the way that our society is set up, but at least as long as these are the conditions that exist. But we felt it was really important to empower people to extract their own, to do it in as safe a manner as possible. And so once that's your approach, you start to see these sort of logical things come out of it, right? Like if you're going to encourage people to extract their own in an attempt to sort of decommodify and put powers directly in their hands, that sort of implies that, hey, well, couldn't we look into growing our own? Couldn't we look into creating sort of a decentralized network of ethnobotanical mutual aid? And so over the years, actually, there's a sister site to the Nexus that we encourage people to check out called Share the Seeds. It's folks who are literally propagating their own medicinal and drug-based plants. And pretty much most of the folks on there engage in a sort of share-like ethos. They'll ask you to cover shipping, but the whole point of it is to get these plants propagated by as many people as possible, especially as we see encroachment around things like iboga and the potential loss of these species from their traditional habitats. And obviously there's concerns around biopiracy and how are people engaging with these plants. And I think that getting into the citizen science of it or the underground research, it was sort of necessitated just by having a sense of these experiences seem so important and so foundational to what it means or what it could mean to be human, to be able to reflect on yourself, to be able to try to engage with other people in loving and compassionate ways, in ways that to me have always seemed like the psychedelic experience has always seemed political to me, because some of the most consistent messages I've got and I've encountered in the literature, whether it's about love or ecological integrity or the importance of, caring for those around you, seem so fundamentally at odds with the way our society has been structured. And so it's like, how could the use of these things not be political?
Another feature, just to kind of riff on a little bit, and I've had, I've as I mentioned in last week's show, I've just been lucky to have friendships with some, really amazing ethnobotanists, not even just in the psychoactive realm, but just across ethnobotany.
Totally.
And finding the kind of ethos of seed sharing and the way in which there's a non-capital motivation that is simultaneously a organic, natural, event in natural history, i.e. you distribute seeds. There's more of them everywhere. They're less likely, it's like, it's a very, it's part of, it's like humans supporting a certain aspect of natural history. And at the same time, it's often mirrored in a kind of politics, a kind of way of relating to others. And then when you introduce the internet, you get this weird kind of doubling effect where the aspect of the internet, especially of online forums, the distributed nature of it, the relatively non-hierarchical nature of code and connection, even the sort of loose limb structure of many of these communities, they all seem to mirror in some way something about what's actually happening on the organic level as well. So there's an interesting kind of integration, but not towards everything becoming one. It's like integration of these levels through the ideals of distribution and decentralization. So it's like the different levels of the practice resonate in a very psychedelic way.
For sure. And I would say, I don't remember who was talking about these concepts a long time ago, but, it's almost like if we contrast that notion of one with all, right? That sort of as opposed to like an individually bound whole versus the unbound entirety. I think that principle, and looking at, again, all of these things sort of presuppose all of these other components that you don't even realize until you start digging around in it. So, as I said, here's this community that's trying to figure out how can we decommodify some of this? How can we promote these ideals and what we think is a preferred way of engaging with some of these plants and compounds. And then, at the same time, ayahuasca is kind of going mainstream to some extent, or at least pop culture, right? I think Sting had just written something about it at that point, and a few other things were going on. And suddenly there's so much more interest in the ethnobotanical marketplace, where you had a few really well-known vendors. And, I think at that time, Bouncing Bear Botanicals was super big. That was before Crystal Cole and whoever else played State's Evidence and contributed to Sloan going through real tough legal stuff. But looking at some of the other vendors that were popping up, we started to see places that were offering vines, ayahuasca vines, that seemed a little odd. And we had a member who was well situated in an analytical lab, and basically said, hey, if we can arrange a network through our community to get some of these homegrown specimens and ethnobotanical marketplace specimens into the lab, I can generate I can run them through the analytical machinery. At that time, it was mostly gas chromatography and mass spectrometry. And we can generate the mass spectrometry files and sort of look into them ourselves, see what's there. And I said, yes, absolutely. Let me know if you want me to sort of collect some stuff in the US and send it your way, we can do that. If it makes sense to have it sent directly to the lab. And so we sort of started setting up this infrastructure where we had folks who were living in areas of the world where they were able to collect wild samples, or where they had pretty large private ethnobotanical collections. We had members who had ordered from a whole variety of different vendors and were willing to go through their orders and sort of break out a little bit because you don't need much for analytical purposes. I mean, we'd have people send between like 1 and 5 grams of vine, which is, nothing. And it's way, way, way more than we'd need for any of the analysis. I mean, a gram is overkill. And so we started generating all of this data. And actually, in order to get the database that we used, it's the NIST database. It's like National Institute for Standards and something else. And that database, the license for it is super expensive. So we found a copy that we were able to pirate. It was like the 2008 database. So we were already 4 years out of date or something when we really were when the project was well underway and in full swing. And, fast forward to today, I just looked the other day, the current version, the current license for that software is $4,300. So it's well beyond our means as people who have no budget whatsoever, who are literally running this software on their own computers, just to try to get a sense of what we're seeing. And yet we started putting this data out, and we saw right off the bat, some of the vendors started posting the spectra to their website, kind of like to advertise, hey, look, we've got the goods. Funny enough, at least one of those vendors was also one of the people selling a bunch of misidentified or unidentified vines. And really, the way that we saw it was less about empowering the vendors to advertise for themselves and more about being able to give the community a heads up saying, hey, this red ayahuasca vine only has harmine. It has no harmaline.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one way of saying that is also like that. It gives you a sense of the complexity of how science and I don't want to use the word regulation, but how accountability works in complex society, and so you're actually serving as part of the mechanism of accountability in this particular case that had to do with some hard data. And that's in a way what we're talking about, and we should probably kind of start moving towards the open science stuff because, that's a really pressing issue right now. And in a way, it's also part of this idea of like, how do you use science? How do you recognize the stacked deck against underground or citizen science or advocacy groups that are not based in large institutions, don't have large budgets? You get into those issues really fast, but part of the idea is to think about it as a system, that there's a system where there's vendors, there's information, there's technologies that can be distributed, there are advisory boards, there's ways of testing, and that all of these different elements all kind of, weave together. And part of what activism means in this space is to keep that ecology diverse enough and distribute the power enough between these different bodies that the whole thing, it's kind of like just checks and balances, the way you learn in what makes the United States government sort of function in some ways. And it's a good ideal.
Sure.
We should still think about it as a good ideal. It's harder to become a demagogue in United States history, although we're clearly showing that it's not impossible. But that idea of checks and balances is also really a way to think about how science can function in society and in the tension between institutional research, academia, corporations or for-profit outfits, which are always going to be part of the picture, and advocacy groups. So all of that's kind of a way to lead up to this recent statement on open science for psychedelic medicines and practices, which was written by, or sort of spearheaded by Bob Jesse, who's an important figure who gets his due in the new Michael Pollan book. I was kind of happy to see Bob Jesse appear there because he's sort of a quiet figure, and even though he's done a lot in the last couple of decades to further psychedelic science, he was really instrumental in kind of working behind the scenes to make sure that the Johns Hopkins study in 2006 came out. He's always been interested in psychedelics, not just as medicines, but also as amplifiers and spiritual vehicles. And how do you get that into the regulatory model, which is very difficult to do. And so he's a very interesting figure. And he felt compelled to come out with this statement. So just just to begin, just tell us a little bit about the statement, what was motivating it, how you found out about it, how it articulated some of the concerns that you've been having more recently as well.
Totally. So, I mean, my awareness of the statement was I had a friend who was aware that the statement was sort of being authored and coming into being. And they were aware that I had just been at this event in Australia, actually where we met, right? Entheogenesis Australis. And they had been made privy to some of the statements made by Rick Doblin and some of the discussions and debates that he and I had gotten into while there. And they were also, as I understand it, aware of the rise of Compass and Eleusis and some other players who were sort of sneaking around the shadows, and felt that if there was going to be a push for the privatization, the commodification, the true hardcore corporate commercialization of psychedelics, like it was like they were seeing the very beginnings of that push. Let's
stop right here and I just inform people, because frankly, before this weekend I had heard of Compass, I had heard of Eleusis, but I hadn't really thought about them very deeply or what they were up to. I mean, obviously this is an inevitable process given the mainstreaming and the decriminalization of these compounds. There's going to be corporate players, but let's talk a little bit about those specific folks, just to inform people about who are Compass and who are Eleusis.
Before we get into that, I just wanted to point out that the four tenets of the statement on open science basically just deal with, the first one is dealing with intellectual and scientific integrity, just asking signatories to report the truth, that even if they're not happy with the results that they're seeing, that they make sure that they're not sugarcoating the experiences and the outcomes and the data that they're generating as scientists. The second one is dealing with issues of being in service, and that as much as we live within capitalism and as a result need to be paid for our labor, that ultimately the point of this work is not to put profits over people, but is in fact to work towards putting these compounds out and make the information available to the public at large, because it benefits all of us. The third one is dealing with open science and open praxis, which basically says that you will make all of your data, materials, knowledge available without engaging in looking for some sort of commercial advantage through them. So obviously there's going to be significant issues when you're talking about doing research within the context of a research institution. There are barriers to some of that are going to come up, but the notion was that these things don't get privatized so that a particular entity can, again, start making serious money off of them. And that ultimately, and then I guess the final one was dealing with non-interference, and that it was really important to put these things in the public domain. And coming from that citizen science background, I mean, it's been really interesting talking a little bit with some folks on the Nexus, where they're like, well, this really doesn't affect us, right? We're in the underground. We don't do this. We don't do that. And I was like, yeah, but consider how much information, how many understandings we get from peer-reviewed papers. We get those peer-reviewed papers because they're being generated by research institutions that then put them into the public domain by publishing them. And so, some people go through the paywalls and purchase them. Other people pirate them. And, at the end of the day, whether you're paying or pirating, that information is already out there. If you think about that in a corporate context, if instead of publishing as peer-reviewed, you keep that as an internal corporate document, it's a lot harder for other folks to be able to get their hands on it, to learn from it. And it may not even be something that you intend on publishing. It could be something that's totally irrelevant to your work, but that even if it doesn't present a challenge to your work, it might be something that might materially benefit one of your competitors. So why put it out there? And so in that situation, we would all lose. And so players like Compass and Eleusis, I know a lot more about Compass than Eleusis. I'll say real quick about Eleusis. It's a company that is run by a guy named Shlomi Raz. They've done a really good job of trying to keep their name out of the press. They were circulating leaflets and flyers I think it was in the Bay Area a year or two ago. They've already got a patent out, I think it was as of 2015, for LSD for Alzheimer's. I don't know. I think they had another patent application, maybe. But again, like you can start researching online, you can look into Shlomi Raz, you can look into Eleusis, that's Eleusis. And so they've managed to do a much better job of keeping quiet. Compass is a venture capitalist-backed for-profit company that is being run by a guy named George Goldsmith and I think his partner Katya. I don't remember her last name, but they have several venture capitalist funds that are helping to finance their endeavor, which includes Peter Thiel's Thiel Capital. And so basically they stepped onto the playing field with this intention of doing, they told a bunch of people, they had a nonprofit organization that was, I think, set up in California. And their plan was to engage in hospice treatment for, it's set up in the Isle of Man using psilocybin as a way of sort of combating depression through end-of-life care. And they approached Catherine McLean and a bunch of other psychedelic researchers. From a distance, it appears that what happened is that they had set up this nonprofit and they were looking to basically mine these folks for their information, their connections, their networks, their protocols. And again, this is just what it appears like based on the fact that this nonprofit existed for about 18 months. It sounds like they were able to get their hands on pretty much all of the things that they were looking for. And then all of a sudden, they crunched the numbers. They realized that they could actually get some assistance from some European regulatory organizations, and all of a sudden switched to a for-profit model, announced that they would be setting up, that their for-profit would be operating out of the UK. And folks like Catherine McLean and others were, as I understand it, maybe not even told that was a thing. There was just a total radio silence. And then Compass appeared with this whole board of directors that included a bunch of pharmaceutical execs, folks from Johnson & Johnson, Janssen, former heads of the EMA, like the European Medicine Agency. It's basically the FDA's counterpart. I mean, you can go through, and I would suggest anybody looking at this, don't take my word for it. Go through the Compass website. They've got, there's this guy on there, Thomas Lundgren, who was the former head of the EMA. And what ended up happening was he left the EMA, but it turned out 2 months prior to him leaving, he set up a consultancy. So literally, while he was the head of the EMA, he set up a consulting agency or consulting firm. And, then 2 months later he leaves. There was like an initial sort of look into what had gone on, and there was some correspondence, and one of the regulatory bodies was like, hey, this looks a little odd. And then I think it was, here we go. December 19th, 2011, Corporate Europe Observatory put out a statement saying ex-head of Europe's drug regulators set up consultancy while still in office, and basically runs through how this guy had set up Pharma Executive Consulting Limited within the headquarters of NDA Regulatory Science Limited 2 months before he left the EMA. And so they basically go through and sort of detail why this is an issue and what they see about, such a high profile revolving door case and how it highlights all of the loopholes that exist within the staff regulations. And so when I started digging around, I literally came at this, I pulled the nonprofit 990s, I looked through the Compass page and started piecing together the fact that it looked like an organization that was not only attempting to build on this massive body of open source or generally made public information that this huge lineage of psychedelic researchers had made available for the good of humanity. And, maybe at the cost of a single paywall for a paper or the cost of a single book in the case of, any of these larger published works. And suddenly, here was this group that was saying, oh, we're ready to do a phase 3 clinical trial based on the efforts that all of these other groups have done. And without having a whole bunch of psychedelically trained and experienced sitters and everything that that the Johns Hopkins team and the NYU team and UCSF, like these are research institutions that have been working on these matters for so long, that have developed the protocols of how to do it with relative safety, that have figured out how do you engage with people having these, in some cases, incredibly traumatic, re-experiencings of war traumas and sexual traumas and childhood, traumas. And instead, right, we had this organization that really knew nothing about what they were getting into, saying, well, look, all these other people have been able to do it. We've been able to talk with all these other people. We think that we should be able to do it based on this. And when you see it, who they've stacked their board with, from the outside, it certainly looks like there's an attempt to subvert the regulators, yes. Right? Why else do you get a bunch of pharmaceutical executives and people who are
let me cut in here, just partly in the interest of time, is that sure. One way of hearing what you're saying is like, oh, capitalism as usual. We know how pharmacies work. We know how revolving doors work. In some sense, if these things are going to become available legally, somehow, whatever, like we can expect some degree of capitalism as usual to start to rear its ugly head. And so the statement on open science is an attempt to maintain the spirit and the commitments of open science, which is something you can describe both in terms of independent people being able to access this information, and also in terms of the ways in which research is at least ideally done inside institutions, with ultimately the greater public good in mind. And again, just sort of in the interest of time, and we can maybe have some time at the end. One of the signatories of the open science, there were a couple of interesting ones. Because it turned out that however cool they might be in their own practice, which is another question, they had signed this open science statement with these values and sort of protocols or that you mentioned, or intentions. And yet they were also doing work with Compass. So one example is Bill Richards, who was a Johns Hopkins guy. We've had him on the show. He's an incredibly lovely man,
for sure,
just like a saint-like clinician. And so, he no doubt genuinely believes these ideas. And yet from his perspective, there's probably like, well, look, if this big corporation is actually going to do it, let's just make sure that the clinicians who are actually dealing with people are good, so more people can have a good experience. And then a bigger example, in some ways with more consequence, is Rick Doblin, the head of MAPS, and sort of bringing MAPS, so MAPS wants to also be a signatory in some sense through Rick Doblin to this statement, and yet they too have had sort of very productive relationships with Compass, and maybe you can tell us the details. And essentially, what your rabble rousing has been is just does this make sense? Can we really sign this and really believe these ideals in open science in the face of coming for-profit motivations with all of the usual crap that goes on with capitalism? Can you really support those ideals and at the same time be dealing with this with Compass? So that was really what you were bringing forward. Talk about what's important there. Talk about how you felt this conversation with Rick that happened at the conference went. We don't have tons of time, but give it your best shot.
Totally. Yeah, I'll do my best. So I think the first thing that feels really important to say is when you read the statement on open science, I think it goes without question when you read the document. The whole point of it is to set up and establish and maintain the material conditions necessary to engage in and preserve open science, right? That the point of signing on to this was because Bob and other folks saw that we were about to see encroachment into this field in a way that jeopardized really the future of psychedelic research, at least as far as it being able to remain open and accessible to many of us. And so in reading that, I know to my mind, there's just no other way to understand the document than to say the reason that you sign this is because you believe in open science and you are committing to working with people that fundamentally exist and operate in ways that contribute to the maintaining of those conditions. The same way that when you sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the reason that you do that is to maintain the material conditions of non-proliferation so that we don't wind up with a ton of nukes and end up, bombing ourselves off the face of the planet. It's not really good if it's just a PR stunt, right? At that point, it doesn't actually protect anyone. So one of the big things that comes up is that Compass is arranged and organized in such a way that they can't sign the document. They're a venture capitalist backed group. Ultimately, they need to provide their investors with a return on their investment, which means that they'll have to at some point provide an exit strategy, such as an initial public offering or a big pharma buyout. And when they do that, all of that intellectual property that they've generated will wind up in the hands of a big pharma. And that means that it will be privatized, it will be sequestered, it will be inaccessible to the rest of us. Similarly, Compass is setting themselves up to be a vertically integrated company, as I understand that. So that means that they will control all of the mechanisms of production from synthesis through therapy, that they will be able to use that control to alienate and block other people from entering that market, and that fundamentally at the end of the day, they'll be able to manipulate prices. So they'll be able to engage in what we call value-based pricing. So currently, if depressive therapy costs an insurer $10,000 a year, and Compass can afford to sell psilocybin therapy for $2,000 a year, why would they sell it for $2,000 if they could sell it for $8,000? Because they've got no competition, because they're vertically integrated and can keep others out. So at that point, the insurance company says, well, hell, $8,000 is still cheaper than $10,000. That sounds great. So people are inclined to say it's a win-win. But if you look at the actual results of that, we're the folks that pay insurance premiums. So, we're the ones who, instead of paying the premium on a therapy that costs $2,000, we're paying a premium on what costs $8,000. And so we will likely get stuck with higher premiums. Now, that's not to say that I'm in favor of mainstreaming psychedelics to the point where we're all paying through our insurers for psilocybin for depression so that we can continue to be ground down in these systems that are depressing without actually addressing the systems themselves. But even if we take the sort of harm reduction arguments that Rick Doblin and other folks are putting out there as far as, we have to engage with these people because, it's inevitable. And unless we do, we have to do this because that will keep their therapists and other people safer because they'll have the proper protocols. To my mind, what should have happened is as soon as all of these researchers who were expressing their misgivings about Compass, who had signed the statement, articulated those to each other, the entire group of signatories should have come together, essentially as a cooperators club. And they should have said, look, we've got all the clout, we've got all the specialized information, we've got all the protocols and the knowledge. We are not willing to work with anybody else who comes into this terrain. And the reason for that is as soon as we start providing them with that information, that will help to solidify their own legitimacy. And fundamentally, these are people who are going to be looking to put profits over people. These are organizations that are going to find ways of minimizing therapist time, of switching from having an actual therapist to using artificial intelligence. I mean, there's a company called 7 Cups that is mentioned as a partner on the Compass website. 7 Cups is an AI. The actual write-up says 7 Cups has developed a training bot which is used by our therapists to develop and practice their active listening skills. Now, not only have we not seen AI that passes the Turing test and can actually present as human, which would bring its own host of issues for sure, the notion of training your therapist on an active listening bot seems absurd, but that's the kind of cost-cutting measures I would suggest we can expect from groups like Compass.
And there's another element that also comes around which we don't have time to go into, but it feels important to mention that also relates to the issues raised at the conference, which is of course a broader social justice problem in terms of access. That it's not just that our premiums go up because we're helping line the coffers of these for-profit companies, but that just generally distorts the cost and availability of therapy, which we can see already now. Let's say in the ketamine therapy market, where it's going to cost you $1,000 to take a dose of something that costs literally $1. And so, whoa, if you're at all interested in access and the communities that should have access to if the hype's as good as it says it is, then obviously a lot of people, our world could be made much better. I'm not sure sometimes if the hype deserves all of it, but in any case, the point is that there's it's one of the things that's the tensions that I've seen. The point to make about this is that I think, and I can't put words in his mouth, but I think if you asked Rick Doblin at the end of the day, Rick, why are you so cheery about dealing with these guys? Because I think you have good intentions. I don't necessarily agree with the way you pursue them, but I think you have good intentions. He would say at the end of the day, it helps get more of the medicine to more people. And I think what's different between that perspective and the kinds of perspectives you're talking about is not just about what's your opinions of capitalism, blah, blah, blah. It's the tension between an individually based idea of psychedelic therapy and psychedelic transformation and one that is necessarily also structural, systematic, ecological, and political in the broader sense. And so it's like we get to see that tension between individual consumerism, derooted soul person solving their own psychological problems versus looking at psychedelics as things that enter into systems, into ecologies, into cultures, into relations between people and things and systems or in institutions.
And I would say that's one of the reasons why people have heard me talking so much about Peter Thiel, because Peter Thiel's vision for society, if you read particularly the speech he gave to the Cato Institute in 2009, his vision for society is one that actually creates the socioeconomic drivers that increase military enlistment. Like lack of social safety nets, the fact that you can get a much higher starting salary with a high school diploma or GED if you do join the military rather than private sector. And so like if this is about, I challenged Rick, as you saw back at EGA, to offer some sort of systemic engagement with how MDMA for PTSD stops the drivers of enlistment. And he just couldn't do it. He clearly hadn't considered it. And so, the notion that if MAPS is going to say, hey, we're invested in working with healing soldiers from their traumas, I would suggest that a core part of that work is figuring out how do we stop the actual causes of those traumas? Because otherwise, while all the therapists go on and on and on about how psychedelics are great because they actually present cures rather than symptomatic treatments, when we look at it on the societal level, what we see is psychedelic therapies being used as symptomatic treatments for society's ills, where we treat the traumas that militarism creates, or we treat the depression that capitalism and being in an alienating, isolating, atomizing society creates. And then we stick all of those individuals back into it. So as much as I take issue with the fact that MAPS is sharing sites with Compass and you could say is kind of subsidizing, the nonprofit is subsidizing the for-profits training through those site sharings, or the fact that Compass signed an exclusivity agreement with Onyx for procuring psilocybin, which could be seen or could be understood as hamstringing all of these other researchers, like folks at NYU or UCSF or Johns Hopkins, if they wanted to get material from Onyx. Those are issues. But if we look at the systemic stuff that's going on, there's no consideration of how can psychedelics actually plug back into these structures that are doing so much damage to so many of us as well as the environment.
Okay, we're going to have to stop there. We could keep rolling. This was a great conversation. I knew it would be too short, but just want to thank you again, David, for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, folks, till next week, keep your minds open.